Thanks, Noah. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to church. My name is Amy, and I'm one of the pastors here. And I just have to say, as we begin, with my kids, I often feel like I'll be like, you are so beautiful. And my oldest daughter will be like, you have to say that because you're my mom. And completely throws my compliment out the window. And so I feel like in understanding the role I play at Forest City, there's something really special happening here. Like this morning, I feel like, the back of your nose prickles a little bit because you feel like crying. Maybe that's just me. But there's something really beautiful here, and we've heard it from guests. We've heard it, Pastor Doug, who was here a few weeks ago. But over and over again, we just keep hearing about there's something really beautiful. And the fact that we have this many people on a long weekend in the middle of summer, I think speaks to that. And while attendance isn't everything, there's something about the leaning in and the being here. And I just want to take a minute. This isn't anything to do with what I'm saying, but I just feel really humbled and really emotional, actually, about just what God's doing here. So thanks for being here. Thanks for being with us. Take a complete lane change. This morning, I want to share with you, in 2009, the spokeswoman for Westboro Baptist Church in Topeka, Kansas, joined Twitter. Now, if you know of Westboro Baptist Church, this is not going to shock you, but what I say next, if you don't know them, might. And this is a church that you might be familiar with, you may have seen in the news, but this is a church that is known for holding picketing signs outside of the funerals of soldiers returning from war, and picketing in front of synagogues with signs that say things like, God hates Jews, or homophobic sayings that I don't even think are appropriate for me to retell, but things that are incredibly hateful and hurtful. And this spokeswoman, her name, Megan Phelps Roper, had been holding these kinds of signs since she was 5 years old. And so she joined Twitter thinking that, she can now broadcast their message beyond just their picket lines that they would hold daily outside of schools and synagogues and all over the place, that they could broadcast this to a larger audience. And truly believing that this was her God-given duty to share these kinds of messages with the world, like a prophet would be heralding the judgment of God, the coming judgment of God. And it wasn't until she joined Twitter and people began to interact with her, and not in the adversarial way that she was accustomed to, where she would almost take that as encouragement, that she was on the right track, that people are opposing her, and she had all sorts of scriptures she would lob back at them in defense of their stances on things. But what began to get in the crevices of her soul were unassuming people that began to ask questions from a place of humility and gentleness. And it was from that point of view that she began to have doubts around the language, the justification, the reasoning her family had used for so many years to promote such condemnation. One individual, a Jewish man, had began to interact with her on Twitter and had engaged with her about perhaps some conflicting hypocritical views of a family member of hers who had shared some previous indiscretions before their life in the church. And he said, why is this person, saved by grace, but other people are condemned to hell? And it was these kinds of questions in civil conversation that really began to upturn her world, that really began to make her feel like, I don't know if I'm on the right track. And eventually she began to no longer participate in picketing. And eventually it led to her and her sister leaving the church, which was mostly actually made up of family members. And in doing so, she was excommunicated from her family. A family that she loved very dearly, and it caused her great pain to leave them. But in a place of such hatred and judgment, the thing that did not change her heart, it was not more hatred and judgment. And I know there is many people who would feel, perhaps I would as well, a righteous indignation as to the things that they were saying and spewing. But it was the gentle conversations and questions of others that began to help her engage with the things that she had held so close and dogmatically for so long. She now travels and writes and speaks about the importance of tolerance, learning to ask questions, not judgment, and of the beauty that is gleaned from empathy, from seeking to understand, something that hate could never accomplish. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look for the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let's take that speck out of your eye, and all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see it clearly removed, and then you can clearly remove the speck from your brother's eye. Now, if you've been in church for longer than a little while, this text is familiar to you. And if you haven't been in church, kind of that like the pot calling the kettle black kind of a sentiment is probably familiar to you. It goes to the idea of hypocrisy. And I'm not going to take a long time expounding this text translation for you because I want to spend the majority of our time focusing on the application, but real quick, just to get us on the same page. The word here that's used when Jesus is talking about judgment, the word is krino, which I think I'm saying that correctly, but my ancient Greek is a little rusty. Krino meaning to separate, to make distinction, to exercise judgment upon. So when we read this and we read about Jesus talking about judgment, he's not talking about some watered down version of judgment or something that we might be misinterpreting when he's saying, don't judge. And so we're like, okay, so judgment is a thing, but how are we to judge? What does that mean for us if we're not to judge? But then, as we'll get to in a little bit, he starts talking about like pigs wearing necklaces, and it's just like, it gets really confusing. But judgment is a word we're very familiar with. And I first off want to say, this is in no way dismissing the courts of law. Jesus is not talking about societal law courts and systems of judgment. This is talking about the personal living out the teachings of Jesus in a community of other people who are made in the image of God. So simply put, to catch you up on a few things, what we are talking about today is judgment. And as we have gone through the last 18 weeks of the Sermon on the Mount, I counted, it's been 18 weeks. You guys are doing great. We've said again and again and again through every conversation and every talk we've had on this subject, Jesus is telling us in the Sermon on the Mount, as Christians, as followers of Jesus, it doesn't matter how loud you say your piece. It doesn't matter who sees you doing it. What matters is the subtext that our heart is communicating. So as we move into the subject of judgment today, that is what Jesus is getting at. It's the roots that dictate the fruit. If I said fruits, that would have rhymed. If it's the roots, it dictates the fruits. That's way more tweetable. Okay, go with that one. But it's the heart that really matters. At the end of the day, Jesus is giving this amazing analogy of like somebody's got a little something in their eye and you're walking around with like a 2x4 sticking out of your eye. It's hard to forget. And he is talking to a crowd of people who would know judgment very well. Not only would they know that as professional judges, being the Pharisees, but they would know actually that the Jewish law does not take kindly to judgment, that they are to love one another, they are to see the best in one another. And he knows, because he's Jesus, he knows the hearts of man. He knows the judgment that they are walking around with. He knows the judgment that as he is saying this, they are listening to him and judging him. He knows his disciples that are there. They all have their own agendas. They're coming with their own bent. They're coming with their own perspective. And they are there, and they are also listening to what is going on as Jesus is talking, thinking about like, oh yeah, those guys need to hear this message. It's us versus them. They need to hear it. And the Pharisees are looking at them going like, those ragtag, irreligious heretics. Both in complete judgment of one another. Us versus them. But Jesus isn't putting a ban on judgment. Jesus is again drilling to the heart that all these people, with all their expectations, their perspectives, their moral high ground, the postures and attitudes of the heart is what wins in the end. Jesus isn't saying don't be discerning, and we'll get to that in a minute. But what he is railing against simply is the specific practices and underlying attitudes that John Stott puts as human, all too human. are for sure what isolate us from the goodness and the power flowing within the kingdom among us. Jesus is all about bringing the kingdom of God closer for people to bring heaven to earth in a beautiful demonstration of living differently, living for a kind of glory that is different than earthly glory. But it all starts with our motivation, because Jesus understands a depth that we often forget. If your roots are planted in arsenic, you'll have beautiful, poisonous apples. So in these verses, Jesus is talking about and warning perhaps about one of the sneakiest, I would say, root poisons there is, and that's judgment, because it's tricky. We make judgment all sorts of things. We call it all sorts of different names. But ultimately, much like what we're learning about pesticides, we often are like, oh, well, we need judgment. We need to judge. We need to root out what's right and what's wrong. But often what we're learning with pesticides is we get those little bugs off, and actually we're poisoning our systems in the long run. That it actually ends up being more harmful. And so what Jesus is speaking about here when he's talking about judgment, and in this context, he is talking about something that I actually had to look up this word when I was studying, and I'm going to potentially say it wrong, so bear with me. Censoriousness. Make sure you use that at lunch today, but not in a critical way. Censoriousness is harshly critical or expressing censure. So you are censoring what somebody else is saying. You are being harsh. You are being critical of what somebody else is saying. And this is the kind of judgment which Jesus is saying, no. This is not the kind of judgment you are to level against one another. And actually, to be censorious, I think I'm saying that right, to be censorious is actually a kind of judgment that does not bring you closer to Jesus. If anything, it tells him a lot more about the status of our own hearts. And then he launches into this random thing about, giving like 10 5-course meals to pigs or to dogs, and to give like pearl necklaces to pigs, and like don't give those to them because they will trample on them and bite them, and you're like, what? And so he's having this conversation about like, don't be judgmental. Make sure you've like removed the stick from your eye, or the log from your eye, and so that you can take that speck out of somebody else's eye. And then all of a sudden he's like, but use your best judgment. Make sure that you judge so that you're not accidentally giving great things to those that don't deserve it. And so we're left feeling like, Jesus, I'm so confused. It's like, don't waste your breath on people that don't deserve it. And I think that would often be perhaps what we would interpret. It's like, well, there's some people that just don't waste your time. And in Jesus' day, there was both the Jews that believed that it was exclusive, that to follow the ways of God was an exclusive thing, and they were to remain an exclusive people. And they're going, that's right, Jesus, that's right. Dogs, pigs, dirty. Gentiles, dirty. Don't waste your time. And then there would be the Christians that would be hearing this, thinking, oh, well, we need to protect ourselves. We need to protect our new movement. And it wouldn't be something that they were saying in the ways of that they didn't have a heart for people, because absolutely they wanted more people to follow along and follow who Jesus was, and they had a heart for missions, but they were motivated by a level of fear of what will happen if we let the wrong kind of people in here. What will happen? Will we just fade back into the obscurity of all the pagan religions around us? And so there was this commonality between both the Jews and the followers of Jesus in this day that was motivated by fear, which, when you're motivated by fear, it can very easily turn into judgment, which would stifle the spread of the gospel. So all of this being said says, don't judge, or you'll be judged. Remove a log from your eye so you can judge others fairly. But be discerning about who you're sharing your wisdom and good news with. Which, if I was the disciples hearing this, I'd be like, okay, yes. Okay, wait, I'm really confused. So if we dig below, the question I think we're all left with is, okay, I agree with this, but how do you love without judgment? And what are we to do with these verses? Because as far as I can tell, we have not gotten any better than they were in the first century in not being judgmental. We have all the best intentions, but there is a tiny little lady who looks a lot like me, who wears this cool wig and carries a gavel, and she storms around in the back of my head as a judge over all things. And I am 100% coming to you today saying, out of anything I have ever taught, of anything I have ever studied, there is always an element of you're introspective and you're looking into yourself, but I don't know if I have ever found a text more convicting than what I read here. That I have struggled with it over the last week, and even in my conversations, the words coming out of my mouth, that I'm like, oh my gosh, there it is. There's that judgment. There it is again. Like, I think Jordan, when he assigned this to me, there was like wisdom. He was like, that'd be a good one for you. Not judging, but just saying. But I think we can all agree we've all had moments of hurt or caused anxiety or anger when we have been on the receiving end of misjudgment, right? And I don't know if you're married, perhaps this has happened to you, or maybe with other loved ones in your life, but I regularly like to do this thing in my marriage that I don't actually mean to do, but we'll be driving, and I'm usually the designated passenger, and we're driving, and I'll go, you know what I'm going to say next, right? And Jordan slams on the brakes. I'm like, did you see that pedestrian? And he's like, yes, I saw that pedestrian. And he really doesn't appreciate my insights into his driving. And so generally it doesn't bode well for me because then he's like, you're going to cause an accident by your misjudgment and mistrust of my driving. He has never yet been saved from any accident by me pointing anything out. He's actually never been in any accident, so he's doing pretty good. But anyways, misjudgment often causes more harm than it does good. Mine happen to be rooted in like trust issues and too much caffeine, but we've all been steeped in experiences of misjudgment, and yet in Jesus' blatant commands against judgment, we receive them, we understand them, and then in an ironic twist, we're like, see that person? Super judgmental. Super judgmental. And we lob this back and forth at each other as those judgmental Christians. And that's not just in the church. Like, we don't want to be considered judgmental, whether you would consider yourself a Christian or not. But judgment and condemnation, although they are things that we probably as the church have been known for a long time, where my brain goes now when I think of judgment and condemnation is actually social media. Because what is condemnation? Condemnation is rejection. It is the thought that he or she is possibly irredeemable and should be rejected. I believe our contemporary language for this is canceled. It is an intolerance for what we believe is unforgivable, or at least grounds for exclusion, or, as I would say I'm guilty of, a passive-aggressive remark, at least. And in a culture where we often believe, if you are not with me, you are against me. If you do not fully agree with my point or opinion, you are the enemy. And you know what the greatest underlying heartbreak is, in my personal experience and perceptions, both being judgmental and being judged? When I see a behavior that is so unacceptable, despicable, and my righteous condemnation, which probably much of the time is not nearly as righteously motivated as I'd like to think it is. I'm not angry about a behavior or a policy or a life choice. I'm angry with them as a person. It makes it us against them. And it's not enough to not agree about a statement or a behavior. As a culture, we cancel or condemn a person entirely, which often doesn't stop there. It often bleeds onto an entire group of people. And that's nothing new. Jews, Gentiles, followers of the way, conservatives, liberals, boomers, millennials, Xers, Apple, Android. There are so many of those people. Those people are the problem. And this isn't just outside the church. Like, the church is known for being judgmental. And I think actually perhaps what's more troubling is we'll say things, and I really do think we mean this truly, we mean it like in a healthy way, but it doesn't actually work, is that we'll say things like, love the sinner, hate the sin. I followed enough people on social media that I think would ascribe to that, but it doesn't come across as loving, it comes across as hate-filled. It comes across with hurt, with pain, with rejection, with judgment. We aren't really good at truly, authentically loving. And what actually might be worse is that we have made some sins more acceptable than others, so we happily live with our own sin, but are condemning or judgmental or holding other people at an arm's length for sin that we don't think is nearly as acceptable. And our society has become increasingly polarized. But I don't think we mean for it to come across like that. I don't think we mean for it to come across so heavy, so judgmental, so condemning, if they would just see it from my side. Now, I'm not talking about the hurts that are very real, that are very serious. And I want to be quick and just say there are things that professionals and counselors and the law and those kinds of things, they are necessary. And that is important, and healing has to happen. But what I am talking about today is personal convictions, things that we have a personal bent on or a view on that we would hold against somebody else. Because when we have judgment of the other, it is often fueled by anger. And not very often do I actually see people who are motivated with anger and are judgmental and all of these things. Rarely do I ever see lobbing judgment and condemnation bridge gaps. They don't have a healthy outcome. It doesn't generally result in people making healthy change in their lives. It doesn't come across in a way that would benefit another. It just comes across as more conflict, as more hate, as more misunderstanding. So I believe most people want to love well, despite behaviors they don't agree with. But how do we do that? So 2 questions. 1, does this mean we don't judge others? We let it all go? Anything goes? And 2, can we truly have authentic, loving relationships with others that we disagree with? Can we do that? Now, judge not is not meant to turn a blind eye to behaviors and faults of others. I don't really have to suspend my reality very far to imagine if I just stopped judging the behaviors of my children. There would be coming to physical blows, and I'd be like, you two just live out your truth. I'm not here to judge. You guys just figure it out. There would be bloodshed in my house, okay? So what this is, when we choose to not bring any sense of critique or criticism or wisdom to things, is it's hypocrisy. Jesus is very clear that there is pain and suffering and evil in our world, and most of that is caused by human hands. And so to plug our ears and to pretend that we don't hear it or see it, we are at best burying our heads in the sand in ignorance, and at worst, it can be criminal or deadly. When there is pain for other people, for us to just say, I don't want to judge, it's not loving one another. But 2, it's not how God created us. All through the Sermon on the Mount, we see that Jesus is telling us to use wisdom, to use our critical thought process, to think through things, to see behaviors, to see things, and are we doing this well, and should we be doing this differently? We are making judgments. We are making judgment calls. And this is rooted in health when it comes from this kind of a place that we are moving towards being more like Jesus. This is not condemnation. This is conviction. So to sum up the idea of judge not is not to say throw out critical thinking, but it is a plea to say be generous with the grace that we have been given. Which leads us to our first application. Judging others. When the Olympics are on, our TV is on pretty much all the time. We're not really TV watchers, but suddenly I'm into sports I didn't even know existed, so that I'm oh yeah, that guy who then runs and then skis and then has a shotgun for some reason, that's one of my favorite sports. I don't even know what that's called, but that's a really cool one. But one of my favorites is the ice dancing and the figure skating, and I just the acrobatics. I struggle to walk in a straight line on a good day, and then I'm watching these athletes, and they're oh, triple sow cow, a little messy at the end, that's gonna deduct points, and I'm loser, that was awful. And then you watch me at my kids' school skating thing, and I'm like, 1, 2, 3, glide. 1, 2, 3, glide. Like an Olympic athlete. I am not, surprise. And so I have this level of judgment of these athletes that have spent their entire lives training to do these things, and I'm like, oh, I definitely would have changed up that routine. I think that one was a little sloppy and poor song choice, and I would have added one more little toe pick situation at the end. And I have no idea what I'm doing on the ice. I'm struggling to do up my skates. But there is something that's interesting in this, because although that is silly, we have, as John Stott says, we have a fatal tendency to exaggerate the faults of others and minimize the gravity of our own. That judgment first starts with us. When we read these verses, they ring through vaguely familiar to what we read when we were studying the Lord's Prayer, that it talks about forgiving the debts of others so that we can be forgiven. That this isn't compulsory, you need to forgive so you're forgiven, but this is saying when you understand the depths at which you're forgiven, you are able to forgive. Which is saying here, as we just sang, I didn't plan this. Hannah and I didn't have a conversation. Although she has the voice of an angel, this song just sounded even more beautiful today. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like you. That's not how the song goes. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound who saved a wretch like me. I once was blind. I once was lost. I'm found and now I see. It goes on to say, how precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. When we're judging others, do we remember that? Is it the, amazing grace that saved a wretch like you? No, it's a saved a wretch like me. And Paul says this in Romans 2:1. Paul says, therefore, you have no excuse, whoever you are, whenever you judge others, for in passing judgment on one another, you condemn yourselves, because you, the judge, are doing the very same thing. This is again talking about that critical eye that we have, that we're finding faults in others. Yet Jesus has covered us with unmerited grace. And then who are we to withhold that? Jordan said a great line this morning that I had to write in my notes real quick. In our team rally this morning, he said, I might actually quote this wrong, Jordan, so you can correct me. But better to think of ourselves as sinners and be saints than to think of ourselves as saints and be sinners. Yeah, that was right? Great. When Jesus says, how can you be concerned with a speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a board in yours? And we often like to think of this as okay, if you have a comparable issue, make sure you deal with that. And then go ahead, you can now critique. We take it as almost like a bribe, get that plank out of your eye and then you can go ahead and have at her. But you know what blew my mind when I read this? That changed my whole perspective. Much like everything we read on the Sermon on the Mount, it is not at face value. The board he is referring to is not the sin that's comparable. The board is the condemnation. That we are viewing others in a condemning way, and it causes us to fail to see them with the same love and the same grace and the same humility that we have been shown. If we have a bent of condemnation, we are clearly missing the truth of the kingdom and the freedom and the forgiveness that we have been offered. The board that blinds us is condemnation. It blinds us from seeing the other person as a human being made in the image of God, and it runs the risk of cutting off the guidance we require from the gentle, subtle, loving prompts of the Holy Spirit. It is hidden from us because we are not dwelling in the freedom of the cross, but the fallible, limited justice of the world. Paul blatantly speaks about this again in Galatians, and he says, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. He's not saying there's no accountability. But watch yourselves, or you might be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. Each one should test their own actions. If they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to somebody else, each should carry their own load. We play that game of like, yeah, at least I'm doing better than so-and-so. We do that all the time. But this is saying you first look at your own actions before you begin to condemn the actions of others. So how do we do this? If we are looking at ourselves and we are introspective and we are seeing the things that are in our hearts, if we are truly, genuinely doing that and we know our limits and we're playing within it and we know that we are humble receivers of grace, Paul is still saying there is an element of accountability. So how do we go about actually living in that way that we are bringing accountability both to ourselves and to others around us? It starts, of course, with our own mindset. And the passage that we so often reserve for weddings and that kind of thing, in 1 Corinthians, it says, love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast. It is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no records of wrong. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in truth. Love always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. Paul is talking in these verses. He wasn't talking at a wedding. He was talking about Christian community. What does love require of me? Restoration in all things, not demolition. These moments of restoration provide two beautiful opportunities for transformation. One, for us to be able to look to ourselves and on what are the things we need correcting. Because so often we miss those. We're so busy looking at the faults of others. We sit down with people all the time that are like, the church should be doing this, the church should be doing that, we should be doing more of this, we should be doing more of that. And they're like, tell me about your discipleship journey. Well, how are you personally implementing that? It's like, well, I'm just as guilty of this. I have all sorts of ideas and thoughts and opinions about so many things. But how am I actually being transformed? And secondly, it provides an opportunity for shared experience, for closeness with another, to relate to another person as they are walking, that we are to be walking with them. Once we have gingerly been made aware of the plank in our own eye, we are able to be moving around those things and to then begin to help our brother or sister with the speck in their eye. Because to leave the speck is not helpful. It causes pain, it causes damage, it causes long-term issues. But when we are on the same leveled, grace-filled playing field, it comes across so differently. Have you ever been there? Somebody has given you correction and they understand exactly where you're coming from. This is what I love about 12-step programs, is that when you have a sponsor, that person has been working their program and their recovery for at least a year. Because then they can walk alongside you and say, I've been where you've been. And there's life beyond here. They can relate to you in a way that somebody who has not gone through the recovery process cannot. They can say, oh, that step was really hard for me too. There is a humility that they have walked the same path as you. And that is the posture in which we are to have. I love this. The Archbishop of Constantinople, one of the early church fathers, John Chrysostom, once said, correct him, but not as a foe, not as an adversary, extracting from penalty, but as a physician providing medicine. You see a beloved or sister you want to share in the abundant life you have. Our drive must come from a healthy place. We should be the first to lay down our lives and understand what people need. And that's where those verses come in about pigs and dogs and jewelry and things, is because often we're like, you know what would be really helpful? This is me as a new mom. People are like, baby shoes. I would love to give you a pair of Nike baby shoes. I'm like, my baby's actually not going to be walking for like a year, but if you put meals in my freezer, that would be really helpful. When we understand where people are at and what they need, it allows a pathway into conversation. It allows us to have an opportunity to have shared experience. We are walking along the road with people. And what Christian words cannot do, a Christian life often can. These are the moments of living in community. These are the moments of when we are in our workplaces. There's not always, you can't, like lots of workplaces, you can't even talk about the gospel. But the way you live your life in humility and that you're examining your own self, it will provide a testimony that often words are unable to do. Whether that is people that you know and love that do not share your beliefs or actually are quite opposed to your beliefs, the way you live your life shows something. The way you are tender and meet their needs where they're at provides an inroads. The way you share your downfalls and the hard time with your kids brings humility, and it allows people to open up. It is magical when you hear people say, yeah, me too. I actually am struggling with that too. But when we are so quick to judge, when we have a log in our own eye of condemnation that would seek to push the divide further, would seek to bring us further apart, when we paint it as them, those guys out there, it only brings people further apart, not closer together. I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to invite the keys back up. But I want to share a situation that happened in my life a few years ago. And it was during the pandemic. And it was kind of the second chapter. Like, everybody thought the pandemic would just be over, like when the clock struck midnight and 2020 was over. And we had moved into a house that we only were in for a very short amount of time. And I was having a hard time with the move. I was newly pregnant. And I remember encountering somebody at a Tim Hortons or something. And I remember just the way he talked to this woman just could not have been ruder. Like, he was demanding and he was entitled. And if there's anything that makes me more mad, it is hearing the way people talk to service industry employees. Like, I'm not a confrontational person, but I was like, buddy, you just try me. I am hormonal and I am hungry. And like, I'm going to say something. And I honestly, Jordan and I both share this mutual, just absolute frustration for when people are rude to other people that are simply doing a job. And it just gets under my skin. And so one day in this season, it was the summertime, I remember it very clearly. I was pregnant. I was nauseous. And I remember being like, hey, I'm going to be a good mom. I'm going to take my kids. There's kind of a little market shop not too far from us, about a 15, 20-minute walk. And Finley insisted on riding her bike. She was about 3. Jack was still a baby. He was about a year. And I'll never forget her insisting on riding her bike. And she's no Lance Armstrong. Okay, I'll just put that out there. She's slow. She's a toddler. And I was like, okay, it's fine. You ride your bike. I'll push the stroller. And I remember us walking along. And if I'm completely honest, I look back at that season and I was probably struggling with some depression and I didn't know. And I was having a rough time in life. And I remember as any walk goes with a toddler, I remember Finley saying I can't do it, my bike's stuck. I need you to help push me up this hill. And I'm like, I am pushing a stroller. I am nauseous. I said, come on, let's go. Finley, why did you insist on riding your bike? And I remember the words coming out of my mouth, and I remember thinking to myself, these aren't kind. And I was like, if she would just have listened, if she would have just gotten in the stroller. And I remember that whole walk, I was mean. I bullied my own 3-year-old. I remember coming home that day and I was so frustrated. I remember ranting to Jordan. I was like, oh my gosh, she rode her bike and she wouldn't even ride it and I had to push it and she just drove me insane and I was so frustrated. And then I remember bursting into tears and saying to Jordan, I am a terrible mother. And I went to her bed. She was asleep, and I just cried. And I stood over her bed, and I cried because I couldn't believe the bullying that came out of my mouth to a 3-year-old that I justified with, I'm tired. This has been a crappy situation. I'm nauseous. It's a pandemic. I had all the excuses in the world for why I talked to my daughter like that. And if I had seen somebody talk to their child like that, I would have intervened because it just was not kind. But often we believe these kinds of things, they're meant for people around us, like the world out there. But you know who probably gets the brunt of your hypocrisy the most? Your judgment is the ones you love. That I have so much judgment for that guy at the grocery store, but then I talk to my 3-year-old like a bully. This is what Jesus is getting at. This is what Jesus is getting at, is that the judgment that you are levying upon others is actually blocking your way of distributing grace. Have you not received this grace yourself? How could you withhold it from others? Imagine us living in a world, imagine us living like people that still hold a standard of truth, but we embrace people the way Jesus did. We embrace them and we hold them close and we have conversations and we ask curious, genuine questions and we share our things and we learn from them, even if we don't agree. And we actually might not agree at the end of the conversation, but it's trusting our place that we are not God, that we are playing one part in a very long story, that we know our limit, we play within it. We have done the hard work, that we can stand in humility and stand with a grace that we have received, and we can offer that to others, that we are loving people well through grace, that not because we have it all figured out and we're going to tell them how to live, but because we can be in a posture that we are okay, that we have flaws and we're working on them. Imagine a world that we lived like that. It wasn't to prove somebody wrong. It wasn't to get our point across, to make them see it the way we see it. But we lived in a way and we walked in a way that peace guided us, that the Spirit of God was guiding us, and we would know the moments of when to have an overt conversation, and we would know the other times to just show up and be present for people. That is what love requires of us. It has the best in mind. It has the hope in mind. It has all of the things that bring life. Not shame, not judgment, not condemnation. That is not our role, friends. This is why we celebrate. This is why we sing songs about the amazing grace, how sweet the sound, who saved a wretch like me, because that is who we are. And this is the truth we want others to know. So, Father, today, God, as we wrestle with what judgment looks like, we wrestle with what authentically loving people looks like. Lord, I pray today we would be once again consumed by the truth of your grace, consumed by the truth of your radical love for us, that even in all of our muck, God, you died for us. You have showed us a better way to live. God, I pray that for those that are in this room today and those that would listen online, Lord, I pray that what they would hear today is not about figuring themselves out so that they can figure out other people, but that we would be in awe of your grace, so much so that we would want to share that with others. We love you, Lord. We're thankful for you. Amen.